Hi everyone, I'm Shaylin here with Reedsy, and today we're going to be talking about passive voice versus active voice. Cutting passive voice is a very common piece of writing advice, and it can make your writing a lot stronger. And it's not a very difficult thing to grasp. It's quite easy once you look at some examples, but it can totally understandably be a little confusing when you're first learning the difference between the voices. So when we say voice, we're not talking about an author's voice, such as this author has a flowery voice, or this author has a very straightforward voice. In this case, we're talking about the voice of a verb. So the voice of a verb tells us whether the subject of the sentence is performing the verb or whether the verb is acting upon the subject. So let's start by just taking a look at some examples. So for example, in active voice, the dog bit the man. And in passive voice, the man was bitten by the dog, or just the man was bitten. So in active voice, we see the subject, in this case the dog, doing the action. In passive voice, the subject is being acted upon. So that's why it's called active voice, because in active voice, the subject is the one doing the action. The dog, which is the subject, bit, which is the verb, the man, which is the object. So let's take a look at another example, also featuring a dog. The cat saw the dog. So here the cat is the subject, saw is the verb, and the dog is the object. But if this sentence was in passive voice, then it would read, the dog was seen by the cat. So in order to make that sentence passive, we put the object of the sentence first, and we took our simple past verb, seen, and we turned it into a past participle, was seen. The two voices can also look like this if we're using the present participle. So in active voice we have, the dog was chasing the cat, and then in passive voice we have, the cat was being chased by the dog. So you can see that when we use passive voice, we add in a to be verb. So usually was or were, which is called the auxiliary verb. So saw becomes was seen, was chasing becomes was being chased. We have to add in that extra word in passive voice, and that's one of the reasons we often want to avoid passive voice, because the extra word makes it quite clunky. So now let's talk about when to use passive voice. It does have a place in writing, and though we usually do want to cut it, what we mean by that is we want to cut it when it's intrusive. But there are a lot of cases where you probably won't even notice the passive voice. So the first case where we might want to use the passive voice is when the doer of the action is indefinite, unknown, or unimportant. So here are some examples. No other problems were reported. The monument was built in 1891. We have unknown subjects here. If we wanted to make these sentences active, we would have to add in a subject, and it would look like this. Workers did not report any other problems. Engineers built the monument in 1891. The second case where we might want to use passive voice is when the result of the action is more important than the performer. So here are some examples of that. These results are drawn from various tests. Hundreds of onlookers were spotted near the fire. Sometimes we also use passive voice to frame an unpleasant message. It can be our natural impulse to take the weight off something unpleasant. For example, all of the money was stolen. So now that we've talked about why we might want to use passive voice, let's finally talk about why we do want to avoid it. Generally, we want to avoid passive voice for two reasons. Number one, it's wordy and clunky. As you can see in a lot of the examples, especially at the start of the video where we were comparing active and passive voice, we added in extra clunky words and it just made a more awkward sentence. Or number two, because it's kind of just like the term says, it's more passive. A passive sentence is less interesting to read. It doesn't put the subject in the driver's seat, so there's just much less energy to the sentence. In the case of fiction writing, it just doesn't feel as charged. But of course, there are times where it's completely necessary. So kind of to illustrate this, let's take a look at these two sentences. My house was broken into last month. Milk was bought by my brother. These are both in passive voice, but the first sentence seems totally fine. It doesn't seem awkward. It just seems like a sentence that you probably wouldn't stumble over. However, the second sentence is quite awkward and something that we would want to edit. We'd want to change it to my brother bought milk. For the first one, we don't know who broke into the house, so we don't need to say, and that's why it's in passive voice. In order to make that active, we would need to say something like, burglars broke into my house last month, and that's also fine. So that's a breakdown of passive voice versus active voice and when you might want to use them. Using active voice is really not that difficult with just a tiny bit of practice. It can be confusing at first, but it's not a difficult thing to get the hang of. A day of practice, turning a couple sentences from passive to active voice can really just kind of solidify it in your mind, and then it's quite easy to implement. So thank you so much for watching, and remember to subscribe for new writing, editing, and publishing videos every Tuesday and Friday. Until next time.